Pass to Garry Jacobs. Garry is the chief executive of the World Academy of Science, of Art and Science. And he is an American who, however, lives in India. So it's a good example, but maybe kind of a chance for me to say it, that the World Academy of Art and Science is intellectually extraterritorial. We don't view the things from the optics of one country's experience, which means we are not tied, if you like, anchored in just the countries in which we work or the countries that are closest to us. We really think of the world as such. So if I pass the word to you, Garry, and I would ask you to say a few things about the Academy, which is not as yet known so well as it will be after today.
Thank you, Bogan. Good morning. We live in a time of unprecedented challenges and also unprecedented opportunities. I believe that's true for Ukraine today, and though this is my first visit to your country, just spending a few days here and especially having the privilege of meeting a number of young, very enthusiastic people, I really feel the truth of the opportunities that are here. The World Academy was founded in 1960 for a similar reason, by people who had been instrumental, somewhat inadvertently instrumental, in unleashing the genie that is still hanging over our heads so many decades later. Ivo already mentioned Robert Oppenheimer, Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, Joe Rothblatt, who was also part of the nuclear team and dropped out in protest when he saw where this was going. But all of them feeling categorically, unanimously, that after the nuclear weapon had been used, we've really got a problem on our hands and we have to do something about it. And scientists cannot sit back passively and say this is not our responsibility. So the World Academy, unlike maybe many other academies in the world, was specifically set up not to study disciplines, not to promote disciplinary science and art, but to look at global social problems and look for solutions to them. And we continue to be occupied with that over this last 55 years. And today we feel we see a time of unprecedented complexity in the world. We've never had this type of complexity. We've never had this kind of change, rapid change. The world, as we all talk about, is becoming increasingly globalized. And all of this, the speed, the complexity, and the geographic reach increases the challenges that we face. Ivo mentioned some of those challenges, and slide, please. This is just a summary of those that we can all easily recognize: the financial crisis, the persistent poverty, the ecological crisis, the fact that we still have nuclear weapons after so many decades, the failure of our institutions of global governance. We really are a world in which nobody's in charge, and that's pretty frightening considering all the work that we have to do. So the question is, what's the solution for us? Is there a solution for us? Is anybody presenting a way out that we can really handle the challenges? No, but go back, please. Sorry. When we look back to what happened at the end of the Cold War, I think it's pretty clear now that we missed a remarkable opportunity. Certainly, in many respects, the world is radically different and radically better than it was at that time. But still, we could have done much more if we had had the transformational leaders that we need to take us into the future. We could have gotten rid of these nuclear weapons. We could have really moved towards a much more global, democratic system of global governance than we had at the time or that we have today. We could have looked to build a cooperative security system that really ensured and protected the needs of all countries. Ukraine was one of the pioneers in getting rid of these weapons, but unfortunately, the others have not followed suit, and it's still hanging over our heads. Please. In fact, when we look at the world today, we see there's somewhat of a paradox. On one side, we have enormous needs that are not being met. Depending on how you count it, 1.5 billion, maybe 2 billion people who don't even have the basic necessities of life, food, clothing, and housing, and so forth. On the other side, we have about $225 trillion in global financial assets, most of it circling the globe every day looking for a speculative return for its owners. And yet, less than 20% of that money is actually being used to support the real economy of the world, to create jobs, to produce the goods and services we need. So anyone who tells you that we don't have money, it's not true. We've got tons of money. In fact, the excess surplus money is the cause of our problems. It's the cause of the speculation in exchange rates, the rapid rise and fall in commodity prices and other things, because that money's not being used for what money was originally intended, and that was really to facilitate production and exchange between human beings to promote human welfare. So we've got this paradox. We've also got millions of people who need education, and my colleague Alberto Zucconi is going to talk about that in the next session. According to UNESCO projections, we need to create about 1 Harvard University every week for the next 10 or 15 years if we're to meet the aspirations of young people around the world for higher education. We have that capacity. We have the knowledge. We now even have, with the internet and the massive open online courses, the capacity to disseminate knowledge and education. But we not only need more education, we need a new type of education, which we're going to talk about. We've got a growing shortage and problems with the way we're wasting our natural resources. At the same time, work of our colleagues in the Club of Rome has shown that we can increase the productivity of the resources we have at least 5-fold. The energy resources and the other natural resources, including water. And if we do that, it's not a shortage that we have. What we have is an extravagant, wasteful, inefficient use of the scarce materials that are there. So we've got a list of needs that we're not meeting, and we've got a list of potentials, and there's a much longer list than this, that we're not fully utilizing effectively. So the question is, how do we remove this paradox? How do we use what we have more effectively to meet the needs that we have? And that's what we mean by a new paradigm. And the reason we're using an odd phrase called new paradigm and not just say we need a new strategy or we need better financial management or something else, because the present paradigm is based on a set of beliefs. It's based on an intellectual framework. It's also based on a, quote, social scientific framework that this is the way society works. We have a special project on the need for new economic theory because we still have, and my apologies to economists in the room, but we're still working on economic premises essentially developed during the Industrial Revolution, essentially inherited from the period of science in which Newton was looking for universal laws of nature, that the scientists should study, identify those laws, and organize our behavior accordingly. But we're talking about human society. We're talking about conscious human beings. We are not subject to the universal laws of nature in the way we run our economy. We're subject to the society we make, the society we create. We can change the rules. We can make it better. It's not necessary that we have large and rising levels of unemployment. It's not necessary that we have exorbitant inequality in the distribution of incomes and wealth. It just happens to be the way our society is structured today. So when we talk about a new paradigm, we mean there needs to be a more fundamental change, not just toying with the interest rates, not just more stimulus packages, government investment, not just more world trade negotiations between countries and things like that. No, we need to fundamentally re-examine the intellectual framework and particularly the values by which the world is being governed today, not just by governments, but by the way our whole society is working today. And that's what we need by a new paradigm. My theme is that crises are opportunities. Next. And history shows that that's true. In my own country, in the United States, back at the time of the Civil War, very few people realized that we came just about this close to breaking up the country, and probably if it had gone just a little the other way, we would have had more like the United States of Europe today, trying to figure out a way to get together and unify themselves into a federation, than the strong federal government that emerged at the end of the Civil War and that built the U.S. into a global economic, social, and then military political power over the next 100 years. It was a crisis that was converted into an opportunity. I mentioned in 1907 we had a great financial crisis. At that time, there was no Federal Reserve. As a result of that crisis, the U.S. Federal Reserve was created because we learned something from the crisis. In 1932, we had not only the Great Crash in 29, we had the Great Depression through the 30s, but in 32, 33, we had an extreme financial crisis. 6,000 American banks failed within a year or a year and a half. President Roosevelt came to power and set in place what later became called the New Deal, which was really not just a way to stop a banking crisis, not just a way to handle the drastic unemployment that the U.S. was suffering from, but it was a fundamental new paradigm put under a fancy new word we call New Deal. He called it New Deal, we're talking new paradigm. Fundamentally, it was an attempt to humanize capitalism. Because up until then, capitalism was just a raw, rugged thing, every person for himself, and a lot of people were being left out. And the New Deal set in motion not only 70 years of financial stability in the United States and safety in the banks until we dismantled it in the last decade or so, but also unprecedented prosperity, growth and prosperity. So opportunities, challenges are opportunities. Crises often generate the energy we need for real opportunities. And that's what happened at the end of World War II when we created the UN. Unfortunately, we haven't finished what we started. That finally led to, after centuries and centuries of warfare in Europe, it led to the formation of the EU. The countries that had been fighting as enemies for centuries suddenly decided to come together. So the question today is, how can we leverage the pressure of the challenges that we face nationally, regionally, and globally to push through, to break through to a new paradigm, to get rid of the values and attitudes and ideas that are no longer relevant or sufficient to meet our needs? There are some other very positive factors going on here. There are deep drivers that are moving us forward. We don't have to be idealistic and utopian to believe in the need or the possibility of a new paradigm. Because with the spread of education, with the spread of democracy, with the spread of our connectivity, the world is changing radically and is going to change much more radically in the next 10, 20 years. The question is, when this opportunity comes, are we going to have the wisdom of leadership to use it, to convert that energy into something better, to build a better world out of it? So that's the question. That's what we mean by the project that we're launching. I think you all have a brochure that just briefly outlines some of it in your packets. The need, is there any answer to this question? This is the 13th conference since the first one we started in June of 2 years ago at the United Nations in Geneva. We've been in 9 countries on 5 continents. in joining in groups like this to explore the attributes of a new paradigm and deal with how do we move from one to the other. This was a famous quote which has inspired us. John F. Kennedy said, "Our problems are man-made." And it's interesting, he said man-made, not human-made. He's taking the brunt of the responsibility where it falls. And they can be solved. I think they can be solved by men and women. But they can be solved by human beings, and that's the important thing for us. There's no sense in us saying it's a hopeless case. There's nothing we can do about it. If we've created the mess, the situation, then we can get out of it. And another one from our founders who said, we cannot solve problems with the same thinking that we use to create the problems. And that's what we mean by a new paradigm. We're going to have to change not only our actions and our institutions and our strategies, we're going to have to change our ideas and the ways we think. So we don't have time to go through all the things that we've discussed in 12 conferences, but I'd just like to highlight there's been a pretty unanimous consensus that whatever this new paradigm is, and we don't claim to have the answers, and we want to learn from you and hear from you and work with you to develop better answers, but we are pretty clear about what some attributes of the new paradigm should look like. The first is we've got to do something about the way we manage our finances internationally. Not just to avoid another 2008, but to use money and financial markets for what they're really intended for, to serve human needs, to build a human-centered economic system which really promotes human welfare, human well-being, and human security. And it's just not doing that today. And there are many things we can do about it, and many of them are known. The second is employment. It's interesting because we're in a country and a region where for decades you had guaranteed employment, and you have moved to a new system where we say employment is the result of some magic process where we all do what we want to do and everybody gets a job, but unfortunately it's not happening that way. We feel that employment is so fundamentally essential to the security of people and the stability of society, in a market economy especially, that we simply can't afford to leave this to market mechanisms. I'm not saying we should go back to a socialist system where the government employs everybody. Clearly, that's not what we have in mind. But we feel there are alternatives. The high level of youth unemployment we have today, okay, just a couple minutes. High level of youth unemployment we have today is not necessary. There are many things we can do if we change our priorities that will equip youth and create more opportunities so that employment can be under control. But that's not going to happen unless we recognize legally that we have an obligation in society. If we're using a system which we call a market system, then we've got to be sure it works for everybody and not just works for a few people. And we have a special project on finance, we have a special project on employment, and we're even working on some pilots to show what can be done. I'm not going to go through all of the others, but I think you recognize these elements. These are things we think are essential. We've got to get rid of these nuclear weapons. We've got to change the way our global community governs itself and make it much more democratic than it is today. We've got to find solutions, and there are solutions to the ecological challenges. It's not that there aren't solutions, it's just that we're not implementing them. And education we'll come back to again. So I'd like to sum up just to talk about the intellectual part of this, which is really what we're focusing on in the academy. We're not an outreach organization, and we don't have field work the way many other good organizations do. So what we're trying to do, we're specifically working in a few areas. One of them is what we call a human-centered transdisciplinary science of society. I'm not going to bore you with details, but we believe that we need to evolve a new social science. A social science that's not cut up into small pieces where we've got economists and political scientists and sociologists and psychologists all working in their own worlds according to different principles, according to different laws, as if these issues are separate from one another. How can we separate our psychological health from the question of whether we have job security or not, or whether we have freedom in the society we are? They're all interconnected. Okay. Second, we need to think differently. And by thinking differently, I mean we need to stop putting things in terms of this is good and this is bad, or we either choose a market or we choose socialism or capitalism or whatever it is. We either have freedom or we have security. These are all of the great scientific discoveries have come from being able to reconcile goals that appear, or phenomena that appeared to be independent of one another. We need much more synthetic thinking, or as some have called it, ecological thinking. Our education, I'm not going to spend a word on it because Alberto will do it, but our educational system needs to really develop not mass producing of the same type of people. We need more and more development of the creative individuality of people. And finally, we need transformational leaders, not just leaders who are going to get elected, not just leaders who are going to address the local incremental problems of today, but are going to really help us move toward a new paradigm. Thank you.
I remember another saying of Kennedy. He said, "Don't think of what America should do for you. Think of what you should do for America." I'm not sure how many people that were here in Maidan that decided to do things out of the sense of obligation to their fellow man. How many of the soldiers, volunteers that are now fighting in the East here, there are certainly not many probably that have heard that saying, but they've acted in that spirit. They're giving their lives out of sense of obligation. They're not asking what the country should do for me, but what in these circumstances, in this crisis of the country, they can do for. And there we are approaching our topic of the, I'll give it, or the theme of the conference. I'll give a shortened version of it. The world is helping Ukraine. Can Ukraine help the world? But we do have time for a couple of questions, and then we'll have a break. Anybody wants to raise a question? As usual, yes. He's known for raising the questions. There is a microphone, probably. Or come up on the stage and shout, okay?
So, thank you for presentation. Your speech...
Shout. Louder. Just shout.
Thank you for presentation. The question is, you announced the obligation, I think, of the government to be responsible for employment. And you mentioned that that's not socialism, but this is an obligation. Can you repeat it once more for us? I mean, more specifically, what specifically the government has do to create employment, because we are in that paradigm, but sometimes we are considered to be old crooks of socialist ideology. But you mentioned this from America. Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
if we have a whole day, we'd love to sit and talk about this, and we can come back for that purpose because it's very important. I'd just mention a fact first. In early 40s, a little known fact, President Roosevelt drew up what he called the Second Bill of Rights. It was a Bill of Economic Rights. And the first item on his list was the right to employment. And his objective was, as soon as the World War II was over, he wanted to put this before Congress and get it adopted because he felt so strongly that these economic rights are essential. So this is not such a radical premise as it may sound. If we examine today the way employment markets work, the way we say, a simple fact is, all over the world, our employers are taxed for hiring people. And employers are incentivized for making capital investments in plant and machinery. Because in the Industrial Revolution, we can see that the most important thing was the accumulation of capital and long-term investment. What about investment in people? We still regard our expenditure on education as if it's an expenditure. We don't account for it as a capital investment to enrich and prolong our precious natural resource. So like that, there are innumerable points at which the existing system is biased against people and biased towards money, technology, not necessarily for anybody's benefit.
If I may actually give a bit of an answer in the Ukrainian context. The way the government can help with the employment issue is by making it much easier for companies to be started, for companies to function. And they will provide the employment. It is, and I think actually we are trying to do it, and sitting beside you is chairman of the committee in the parliament on industrial policy. So I'm sure he could actually give even a better answer, but briefly. But let me add another thing, lest you have an aversion to socialism as maybe Garry has. Just a reminder, Sweden, which was a pretty poor country until 37, exactly. And then a meeting took place between people from, unions, people from the government, and businessmen. Solzhenitsyn meeting, very well known. And then, actually from then on, socialists came into power. There are other things that happened. And the socialist government was in the government for 40 years. And that's the period in which Sweden really moved, and tremendous innovations, and the economy functioned extremely well, no unemployment, etc. So there is a socialism and socialism. And I think certainly on the other side of the sea, socialism sounds like a little bit communism. Well, there are different brands, and there's an example. Because the odd thing was that because of petroleum crisis, when the conservatives came into power in Sweden, they nationalized more enterprises in 14 months than the socialists did in 40 years. But since the time has run out for questions, I'm sorry that it was so brief. We were a little bit too, how should I say, too articulate, so we did not leave you enough time for your questions. But we'll try to do that in the following session. And now there is a break, which is one of the best parts of the conference, always. So we'll see you back in, what is the time? In half an hour. So enjoy interacting, and see you back, but on time.